Canadian children's television is sometimes stereotyped as being kinda unhinged. Like, the first two Canadian kids shows that come to my mind are literally Total Drama Island and Totally Spies, which are infamous for being crude and kinda fetishistic, respectively. There's probably a ton of reasons for this, one of which maybe being the Canadian government's involvement in media production. See, in Canada, programs aired over radio, television, and even YouTube must contain a certain amount of Canadian content, and the government also has a large hand in funding the content that does get made. The implementation, especially for things like video games, leaves a lot to be desired, but overall, I think it has had a positive impact, and on a personal level, it has helped a lot of my arty friends get off the ground. For shows, I think it's generally been more positive than it has not. It's kind of hard to say for certain though, because essentially every show has benefited either directly from the government or indirectly from the regulations. I'm always a little surprised when the credits roll on something like the CBC or Government of Canada are credited, but it's remarkably common. Even the provincial broadcasters like TV Ontario would help produce and distribute shows, such as
machines, lifting and pulling and flying so high, building a building up to the sky. You can watch them all day and never know why they're mighty machines. Mighty machines, working for you, doing mighty things there. Mighty machines.
I think Mighty Machines is one of those positive examples. It's a show about how machines are used in the world and about the logistics that go into accomplishing their tasks. It's all presented in this really adorable way where the machines themselves act as narrators, being personified with personalities and voices, and I love it. The show was an absolute staple of the autistic Canadian experience during its production in the late 90s and 2000s. And over the last summer, I rediscovered it through a friend. She showed me episode 26, Buses, Subways, and Trains, since it talked a lot about Ottawa's rapid transit network in the early 2000s. I thought this was really cool since Ottawa Rapid Transit does things very differently from elsewhere, and even more so at the time the show was produced, and I really like seeing something professional produced about it. Looking at it portrayed from another perspective though, it was really cool seeing Bus Rapid Transit portrayed in such a well-researched and easy-to-understand way. English language media tends to mystify public transportation, and it often fumbles pretty hard on the details. So seeing the old children's show avoid all of the common pitfalls is really impressive. Being 20 years old, though, much of what it has to say is now incorrect or misleading, simply due to age. This is true for a lot of Mighty Machine episodes, but I don't have the same level of autism for the other episodes, and therefore, they don't matter to me. Buses, Subways, and Trains, on the other hand, we're going deep on this baby. The episode has 5 sections. The first is about buses in Ottawa. The second is about urban trains in Ottawa. The third is about regional rail in Toronto. Fourth about metro in Toronto. And the fifth is about Toronto's tram network. Canadian public transport was sort of in a lull during the mid-2000s to early 2010s. And it relied heavily on past decisions and laurels. The period after this, though, has seen so much expansion it is kind of unreal. So we have a fuck ton to talk about when comparing it to today. The part in Ottawa opens up with a city bus touring the transit network, where he shares his thoughts on car traffic and why people should take the bus instead of drive. He says he'll be okay as long as he's in a bus lane and talks about why he's better for the environment. Afterwards, the show sneaks in some shots of some very Ottawa landmarks, like the Canadian Parliament buildings and the Tulip Festival, despite neither actually being directly on a bus route. It is kind of funny though, because nowadays, the Tulip Festival has exhibits about Dutch urbanism, and therefore going out of their way to include the festival in the transit video kind of makes contextual sense, at least in retrospect. Afterwards, he hops onto the Transitway, which is a bus rapid transit network in Ottawa, and he gets really excited to talk about it, especially with people who haven't seen something like it before.
It's a terrific thing you might not have in your city, kids. I'm on the Transitway. It's a special road just for buses.
The transaway is completely separate from car traffic and is for buses only, and goes all around the city. You can get a sense of the scale of the transitway from the shot at the big transfer station, which in real life is called Herdman, where buses are passing every couple seconds. It's also kind of funny though, because Herdman, back then, was basically just a shack in the woods, whereas now it's a glorious, multi-level glass masterpiece, also in the middle of the woods. For the most part, the rest of what they talk about is pretty similar between then and now, including the fact that bus drivers are very kind and helpful. I like the comment about how that's a bus with a bicycle hooked onto it. Bike riders like that feature. Literally peak cinema. Literally peak cinema. After the buses show off how they're accessible, it goes on to talk about the bus's friend, the special transit train, who we call the O-Train. They make a comment about how fancy the train looks, which is very funny, since the train in question is a used hand-me-down from Deutschbahn, modded with a comically gigantic snowplow for winterization. This section mainly goes over some basic railway operations and characteristics, like level boarding, passing sidings, articulated carriages, and how smooth trains are to ride. Although, given the sound of the track and the clip from inside the train, it doesn't look nearly as smooth as it is nowadays. The O-Train does say something very particular though. She notes how if the line was longer and had more stations, she could move way more people, and how she'd also like that. And that is exactly what happened. In fact, Ottawa has largely switched away from the bus rapid transit model espoused in the episode entirely. The rail line highlighted in the show, which we now know as the Trillium Line, was only 8 kilometers at the time of air, but recent expansion work has made it 24 kilometers long. On top of that, Ottawa has also built an entirely new line called the Confederation Line, which itself is 12.5 kilometers long, with 27 more kilometers currently deep into construction. And this is where the present majorly diverges from the show. Ottawa's rapid transit system has been notoriously successful over the last 50 years, despite initially being a small and very sprawly city. In the early 2000s, the city even managed the highest per capita transit ridership in North America, a position which is now held by the urban juggernaut that is Montreal. This success forced Ottawa to build rail out of necessity, and as we'll see as a trend moving forward, there was a significant amount of momentum behind the forces of change. In this case, it was primarily based on capacity and financial concerns. In the mid-2010s, the bus lines were completely saturated and buses were sitting bumper to bumper. The city simply couldn't move the number of people they wanted to using buses, and the city also knew it couldn't afford to scale the operation up. Trains are so effective because of how energy and space efficient they are. Buses, on the other hand, carry significantly less people per driver and take up much more space since they need room for error when turning. But Ottawa was treating its buses like a metro, and it was too much for them to handle. This had the knock-on effect of making it difficult for the city to serve routes that weren't a part of the transitway, since they simply didn't have enough buses or drivers. Retooling the bus rapid transit system to be rail-based had always been part of the plan since day one, and it was actually the original desire for the city when building the transitway. This became reality once the city opened the Confederation Line, whose primary purpose is to ease the strain on the city's bus network. To put into perspective how insane the level of bus service was, the city now operates the Confederation Line, which is a metro every 4 minutes at peak period. And at one point, even considered running it every 3.5 minutes for capacity reasons. And they tried moving that number of people with buses. But Ottawa still has a significant amount of bus rapid transit, some of which will even continue existing after the full O-Train build-out. But it no longer forms the core of the city's transportation network, as it once did, which is probably for the best. This is in stark contrast to buses, subways, and trains, where the O-Train is treated like an auxiliary helper to the buses, and it isn't as useful as it could be.
stop is right at the Transitway station, folks. So any passengers that want to switch to a bus can hop off here. See you later, kids.
O train is sort of small compared to commuter trains in the big city, kids. Wait till you see the GO train.
Today, Ottawa's Confederation Line has some of the highest ridership of any urban rail system in North America. And yes, that's comparing a single 12-kilometer rail line in a medium-sized city to entire rail systems in massive cities. And the medium-sized city still looks favorable on that comparison. But even then, the O train is kind of small compared to commuter trains in the big city, kids. Wait till you see the GO train. And yes, I'm ripping this straight from the video. It's literally peak cinema. Have you ever heard a transition this smooth? Mighty Machines has the GO train introduce itself as an inner-city commuter train that takes workers from outlying towns into the regional center, which in this case is downtown Toronto, using steel wheels like the O train, but instead using double-decker cars for the carriages. The trains are also much longer than the O train, being 12 cars long and carrying several thousand people on a single train. She also talks about level railway crossings and how she thinks the drivers waiting at them should simply use her instead one day and leave their car at home. The reason she goes out of her way to talk about her wheels is because in Canada, most, but not all, trains use steel wheels. So the most heavily used rapid transit system in the country is the Metro de Montréal, and it relies on rubber-tired trains. The Metro has significant cultural influence for a load of reasons, but since this show was designed for Canadian audiences, it has to acknowledge that some trains don't use steel wheels. It probably wasn't actually necessary, since it's still English language and probably doesn't actually target Canadian, but I still think it's really cool they do it nonetheless. Beyond that, though, the moniker of inner-city commuter train used in the show has kind of begun to fall out of favor. The language used over the last 15-ish years, both officially and unofficially, has been steadily moving towards calling the GO train regional rail instead. The difference is subtle, but important, and it reflects the change in GO's mandate to serve all kinds of trips, rather than just commuting. This small change has had dramatic impacts on the ground, going from 6 trains a day on some lines to 4 trains every hour, many of which operate express. Trains also accelerate faster, the track's quality and capacity has been improved a ton, there's been loads of great separations everywhere, there are so many new and rebuilt stations, and there's been a general cultural perception shift that the GO train is important in the eyes of the public. Fundamentally, the GO train is completely different now. To be frank, the frequency improvement alone makes it entirely different as a system because of how huge a jump it was. The segment in the show ends with a GO train leaving for the suburbs, while mentioning how good underground trains are at moving people in the big city, which segues us into the next section on metros. The subway in the show is incredibly smug about car traffic and thinks people who drove to Toronto are silly and should have used him instead. He shows the audience how they would have used the subway, and he gives a brief primer on some subway things like how trains are super frequent and the purpose of the yellow strip on the platforms. The station tour in the show immediately demonstrates one of the things that hasn't changed since the production of the show. The Toronto subway is overcrowded and over capacity. Even Bloor Young is still busy in Mighty Machines. The subway segment as a whole feels kind of like a tutorial and overview of metros in general, although a part of this is due to the fact that the Toronto subway itself is kind of basic as fuck, using normal metro trains and normal grade separation and normal third rail electrification. The third rail part is actually the best demonstration I've ever seen for the thing, but it's still a pretty standard aspect of metros broadly. We also see the reference to rubber wheels once again, with the subway also specifying that he has steel wheels and not rubber wheels. The end of it mentions how important streetcars, aka trams, are, since they go places the subway doesn't. Unfortunately, due to the nature of politics in Toronto, which I'm going to expand on later, there isn't much different between subway then and now. Even down to the jingle and trains used, they're the same. Two of the lines have gotten new trains that no longer have the front window, but the overcrowding is still present, as is the barebone stations and limited reach of the subway network. The trams are very similar in this regard to the subway, but there's still a lot more to say about them. The show insists on calling them streetcars, but that is silly, so I'm going to call them trams. The tram in the show says she's kind of like a bus on rails, and oh my god, she is so right. Speak your truth, queen. So many people are convinced that there is something more fundamental that is different between the two, but there really isn't. Just ask the tram herself. Even she says so. She also reminds us that trams are electric, like the subway, and therefore they don't contribute to pollution, as electricity in Ontario, Canada is generated via nuclear fission and hydro dams almost exclusively. The way she connects to the overhead wires, though, has changed since the show, and she now uses the more contemporary pantograph system that has become dominant on railways worldwide, instead of the unreliable trolleybus system she had in the show. Worth mentioning that the Confederation line in Ottawa also uses pantographs instead of third rail, despite being a metro line. This, along with most differences with the current day, ultimately comes down to a change in vehicle. The trams and waiting machines were custom built by the Ontario government, since there weren't any tram rolling stock manufacturers at the time of their build. See, most tram makers were trying to pull out of the business, since cities everywhere were replacing them with buses. Toronto, of course, being a massive exception. The trams made by Ontario followed a lot of traditional tram design specs, and by the time of buses, subways, and trains production, these trams were nearing end of life, and in the 2010s, they were replaced by a fleet of modern, multi-segment, low-floor articulated trams. These trams, also curiously built by a Canadian company, have pantographs, level boarding at platforms, step-free access elsewhere via a ramp, and are all articulated. They look much more like a modern contemporary tram than the very dated and almost bus-like look of the ones in the show. Despite this huge change in vehicle, though, the tram network still holds on to vestibular features like unidirectional operation, shared lanes with cars, high track maintenance due to cars, service interruptions due to cars, overcrowding and incredibly slow operation due to cars, too many switches, curves that are too tight, and a lack of new built tramways. All of these are all being addressed, but it is being done on a scale of like one thing every couple of years, so Toronto is a whole other beast when it comes to trans expansion broadly. The rate of change and expansion is much spikier than Ottawa, since Toronto's Conservatives have regularly fought back against trans expansion. Bulk transport expansion in Ottawa has been so smooth and consistent in comparison because good transit is seen as a non-partisan issue, and everyone agrees it's critical for the city, even deep into the suburbs. You'll regularly see corridors designated rapid transit in Ottawa long before anything gets built there. But since Toronto also gets disproportionately higher levels of funding,
while supporting the largest transit expansion in all of North America, as you heard the minister say, over $70 billion, including new subways and LRT lines right here in the GTHA. But friends, at a time when it's never been more important to deliver infrastructure for our growing regions and our growing economy, we need to do everything possible to deliver on our commitment to build Ontario. We need to get it done, and we're getting it done. Traveling our province, talking to business leaders, union partners, frontline workers, people are increasingly worried here in Ontario and across Canada that we can't do big things anymore. That's why we're going to continue focusing on building.
and also because it's twice as dense, the scale of projects that do make it through the politics of the city are much larger scale than Ottawa's, and such is the case with GO's regional railification. The changes to GO began happening soon after the episode was published, as GO began to slowly acquire new track rights piecemeal and continuously made small changes to incrementally improve their service quality. In the mid-2010s, the rate of change accelerated a bunch, with GO amassing enormous amounts of funding and
As you heard the minister say, over $70 billion.
working on improved station and track layouts, electrification, more efficient operations, European train control signaling, which is the first of its kind in North America, and its goal is to have a peak core frequency measured in seconds rather than minutes. The scale is huge. The Toronto subway and tram system, in contrast, represent the other end of inconsistent expansion, and are almost identical now as to what they were in the show. The trams and a couple subway lines did get a facelift through a new vehicle, but are otherwise fundamentally the same, even down to the small things like the stop sign to tell drivers not to run a deboarding passenger over. The idea of don't fix what isn't broken also simply doesn't work here, since the subway has been over capacity since the production of the show, and the trams have only gotten slower and less reliable. Some things being completely rebuilt to not even resemble what they were in the show, while others are nearly identical, is kind of emblematic of the spikiness of expansion. But what my comparison with the present fails to acknowledge, though, is that the spikiness also means a windfall of change is coming in the next couple of years once we hit the next spike. For example, the Ontario Relief Line project in Toronto is meant to supplement the existing young subway's capacity and create a network effect in the city. Riding off the back of the connectivity provided by the nearly complete Eglinton Crosstown that will make whole new trips possible. There is also many new bus rapid transit and tram lines opening and under construction across Toronto and the region broadly, in addition to subway extensions and station improvements and a bunch of other small things. The city is even finally planning a new district in conjunction with expansions of the tram network, something that regrettably hasn't happened before. This particular district is also meant to be primarily accessed by tram, and it's being designed as the primary mode in mind from day one. A less shiny example of change can also be seen in the very recent, within the last year, change to the King Street Priority Corridor, which now uses traffic guards to ensure the street is a pedestrian zone bisected by trams with their own lanes, as was originally intended when the Priority Corridor was established. The Mighty Machines episode ultimately culminates by returning to that city bus in Ottawa. He gets secondhand eepiness from hearing the stories of the GO train and subway, and decides to head back to the depot to wash up, eat, and get ready for bedtime. Truly the Imogen demo of Canadian cinema. But we still have more to talk about together. It may seem strange to get so excited over a 20-year children's show about Anglosphere public transit, but you must understand, I have autism, and I also need to make some kind of video to hard pivot towards Y2K content. I can't just do it with nothing. The reason this show in particular makes me so excited is because of how thorough and accurate the video was for its time, and yet how completely inadequate it is today. Urban Canadian public transport has always done things differently from other English-speaking cities, and having a well-researched and easy-to-understand piece of media documenting that is incredibly valuable. Canadian public transit has also changed dramatically for the better since publishing, and that is also a story worth telling in its own right. My comparison here kind of acts as a microcosm of the larger Canadian transit explosion that has happened in the last decade, which echoes the changes seen elsewhere in the country with things like entirely new metro systems such as the REM coming online and new lines being added to basically every existing urban rail system in the country, with a new system being created for cities that didn't previously have any rapid transit at all. This also speaks to the growing consensus that public transport should become most people's primary form of transportation, which has permeated deep into Canadian culture ever since Monsieur Jason Slater started making videos. Many decision makers were already well aware of urbanism, but the public at large has begun to support it widely as well since. I guess I could also make the argument that this is exactly why it is so important to protect Canadian media the way we do, since it allows us to share new approaches to the problems facing society and come to our own conclusions. Slaughter was Canadian until recently, after all. Without these regulations, we'd likely be exposed to content about somewhere much sprawlier where public transit isn't even socially acceptable, which would completely throw off our own perception of our own transit for the worst, and we'd miscalculate our current expansion work. I could even go back around and say that much of the current failures in our transit expansion come primarily from having an insular Anglo outlook, and that we should be willing to try new things that our English-speaking contemporaries haven't tried. Our high-speed rail line will take ages to build if we model it off of the UK's HS2, and many of our best projects come specifically from deviating from English-speaking norms, like how the REM is elevated, automated, and was protected from financial and political implosion through the case, who themselves have become a rare public sector entity in the country with lots of in-house knowledge. But really, all I want to say is Wow, I sure do love how they gave the bus I took a voice. I think that's cool as hell. I sure hope he sleeps tight. And I sure hope you sleep tight too. The scale is huge. The part in Ottawa. Oops.